grateful believer in Jesus Christ. 4 years recovered from pornography and codependency, and I still struggle with anger and negativity issues, and my name is Nate.
Hi, Nate.
I was born in the Bronx in New York City in the projects, and for those who don't know what that means high-rise, low-income tenement housing. I lived on the 19th floor of a building where the elevators only worked most of the time, and the stairwells were where the homeless and the drug addicts hung out, so every day was more or less an adventure. We had no AC, and we had steam heat through clangy pipes that announced their arrival with a literal bang. And second-degree burns at a young age taught us to not touch the pipes during the winter. Character building.
Yeah.
My sister Tina, and I shared a bedroom the first 19 years of our lives, and of my life, and we didn't realize it at the time, but the room was so small that it could only fit bunk beds, and from my top bed, I could literally climb out and stretch my legs to stand on the dresser on the opposite wall. So the room was kind of little. It wasn't all bad though, because the view out of our window was pretty spectacular. We could see the George Washington Bridge in the near distance out our bedroom. The planes taking off from LaGuardia Airport flew right over our building. And on a good day, we could see almost 20 miles around. In that regard, Tina and I knew we were lucky because most project buildings were clustered close together, and most people who live in the projects can only see another building out their window. So we were kind of lucky that we were one of the outside buildings. So my mom was a Jewish white girl from the nice side of town, and she was ostracized from her family for getting with a Puerto Rican from the Bronx. What really happened was a one-night stand with my dad turned into me. And her inability to get an abortion at the time trapped her in a relationship with an abusive drug addict that my mom's family spent, for the most part, wanted little to do with, except for my grandfather, who was super awesome. And so I've had a very colorful and eventful life, so to try to squeeze a lot of that into the time I have, I'm really going to touch a lot of the high points. So please know there's a lot of context to everything I'm going to say tonight that is missing. Let me say up front that, because it's important to my testimony, that my dad and I have reconciled, because there's a lot of things we're going to talk about that were hard for him and hard for me. And it's important that we know that, because, we'll talk about that. We didn't recognize it at the time, but for my entire life, my mom suffered from mild schizophrenia, which presented itself by an inability to parent us, care for the house, or for herself. And from a young age, Tina and I walked ourselves to school and took care of ourselves while my mom mostly stayed in her room, smoked cigarettes, and talked to herself. I grew up as a nerdy white kid, small for my age, in a community that was predominantly Hispanic and African American, so I got beat up a lot. Because of that, I didn't spend a lot of time outside. I didn't learn to socialize very well, but the two things I learned to do at a very young age was read and tinker with stuff. I was super curious, I read all the time, and I took apart just about every home appliance we had in the house. Decades before there were YouTube videos that could show you how to put it back together. Yes, that's right, there was a time before the internet. Weird. My dad started showing me off to all the neighbors how I could read even difficult and complicated textbooks and technical manuals way outside my grade level. And my dad, for all his faults, did three things really well. He made sure I had any book I wanted. He never got mad when I took things apart for being curious, even when I couldn't put them back together. And he repeated over and over again that if I ever tried drugs, he was going to actually kill me. Yeah, and I believed him. Besides, in my neighborhood, you didn't have to try very hard at all. You know, remember, we're talking about in the Bronx, in the 70s and the 80s. So you literally just had to leave your front door if you wanted to find drugs and people using them and to discover how it destroyed people's lives. So I knew very early on I didn't want to do drugs because I saw all around me what drugs was doing, what drugs did to people. But I had no idea drugs were why my dad would have these rages I could never explain and was always afraid of. So my dad held down a good job for being a drug addict. And it was usually cocaine and LSD, which, in case you don't know, doesn't mix very well. My dad would come home at 6 p.m. every day, and my sister and I would struggle to clean the house and make as little noise as possible because we never knew what kind of mood he would be in. Even if we did everything right, it would take nothing at all to set him off. And as the oldest, I took the brunt of the beatings and the abuse. Tina and I have always been super tight, even to this day. And because it seemed to us like his abuse was more restrained toward her, she took it upon herself to make my dad stop when it looked like he was going to actually kill me, which was more often than I'd like to remember. See, here's the crazy thing. When my dad wasn't high or in one of his withdrawal rages, he was actually really amazing. He was really a cool dad. He was affectionate. He would go with us to ride bikes. He was athletic and run neighborhood paddleball competitions. I honestly thought he was Superman. The guy he could do anything. He would get into these cool hobbies like playing the guitar, getting into photography, building and modifying CB radios. And again, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s before any of that stuff was digital or anything like that. And everything my dad did, he did 200%. Which made up for the fact that my mom, who was always in the house, was never really there. The problem was that when he did drugs, he did that 200% as well. And, cocaine in the late 70s and early 80s was expensive. So these cool things we used to have as hobbies would disappear when needing the next high came sooner than the next paycheck. Being smart became my out because teachers loved me and all the big tough kids started liking me because I didn't mind doing their homework. Everyone thought I was the smartest kid in the neighborhood and I loved it. The problem was with being a curious reader was that my dad was a porn addict and he kept all his magazines in the front closet. He never worried about my mom finding them because she didn't care. And by the time I was in grade school, his porn addiction turned into having multiple girlfriends on the side, which he justified by my mom being present but absent in our lives, which was accurate. Me being shy, sick a lot, and socially awkward was really difficult for my athletic, machismo dad, and it didn't bother him that I knew where his porn magazines were because he couldn't understand why I wasn't chasing girls like all the other boys my age, and he wanted to make sure I grew up straight. I was too young to understand what that meant and process what I was even looking at in those magazines and actually learn to become really intimidated by women, which only freaked my dad out even more. To fix me, he would take me to Hunts Point so I could meet prostitutes, which did nothing to help my self-esteem or even understand what I was supposed to be feeling. Meanwhile, the cycles of drug use continued, and we shifted between life and my dad being well and no money in the house and my dad having rages every day at 6 p.m. Through all of this, my dad was seeking God in the way he knew how. And in this course of time, we were Catholic for a while, long enough for me to start being an altar boy. Then we were Jehovah's Witnesses for a while. And we went to one or two other churches that I barely even remember. And like everything else, my dad was in it 200% until he wasn't. And back in the drugs. So each time, Tina and I were in it too. All of that changed one day when I was 12 years old. So one day in the middle of one of his rages, he was beating me again for no real reason. And I don't know why I did it, but I just hugged him. And I said, I love you, and then I was sorry. I don't even know what I was sorry for. He stopped dead in his tracks, and he started to cry, and then he very slowly pushed me away from him with a lot of tenderness, not in a bad way, not in a mean, angry way, just real, like picking me up and setting me down. And then he left the house. And I don't remember him coming back home that night, before I went to sleep, at least. And the next night, he came home really late. But he was in a good mood, and this time it was different. And for the next couple of nights, it was different. He didn't say anything, he didn't say very much, and he just wanted to hang out with me. And every time, he would just hold me really tight. And I loved it, because like I said, when it was good, he was affectionate, so I didn't notice right away. All I really noticed was, this is going to be one of the good curves, good times, you know? For a few more days, this kind of repeated himself, where he was coming home late, but he was in a good mood. He was holding me tight. And then one night, he told me everything. He said he was a drug addict, and I had no idea. Talked about his girlfriends. I knew about some of those. And how he was giving all of that up for Jesus. That was a new one for me, because all I knew about Jesus was that he knew everything you did and had a bunch of rules you had to follow if you wanted to go to heaven. My dad said Jesus was someone who we could know and wanted to know us. So we started going to this little storefront church called Iglesia Pentecostal Riobos with Pastor Luis Vigo on 3rd Avenue just off Tremont in the Bronx. That building isn't there anymore. But when I was 12 years old, that's where I gave my life to Christ and got baptized in the Holy Spirit. An experience that actually kind of freaked me out. I poured it all out in front of the podium that day, and my sister got saved about a week later. So we're going to church, we're all saved, and everything's awesome, right? Nope. I wish I could say everything was great after that, but getting saved is only the first part of anyone's journey to freedom, to the freedom that Christ wants for us in Him. To start with, just like everything else my dad did, we were in it 200%. So if you know anything about Puerto Rican Pentecostal church in the 80s, that meant church evenings 4 days a week and all day Sunday. You know, my mom, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with this church thing. My mom remembered much better than Tina and I about my dad's Catholic phase and Jehovah's Witness phase, and she saw this as just another phase he was in before going back to being an addict. But about a year of this phase going on, my mom figured out that the Jesus thing wasn't just another phase. But in my house, following Jesus meant going to church 4 days a week and following all the rules. So my mom said, she told me she didn't want anything to do with any of that because she resented everything about how my abuser dad, she got trapped into a relationship with, was now telling her how she needed to fix her life and get with Jesus. I was all in though. And I did the sidewalk preaching with a bullhorn, praise songs in the park, and for anybody that speaks Spanish, con pandareta de culto, I was doing all of it, you know? And then I had people actually prophesy over me that I was going to be a pastor when I grew up, which kind of freaked me out because all the pastors I knew had these super powerful sin redemption testimonies and these really great stories of where they had come from and where God had brought them to. And I just imagined myself growing up to be this nerdy white kid with no testimony except just being a homeboy growing up in the Bronx. What'd you do? Nothing. I read some cool books. Besides, by this time, all I wanted to do was work on airplanes or work on electronics, and being a pastor didn't sound like either one of those. You know how some people say that, oh, he's got a Joseph anointing, or him, she's got a Moses anointing. Well, I'm going to be honest, I had a Jonah anointing. You want me to do what? Yeah, I didn't want any of that. So, as soon as I figured out God wanted me to be a preacher, I ran the other way as fast as I could. So being the biggest nerd in the neighborhood helped me score a full ride scholarship to Hotchkiss Preparatory School in Lakeville, Connecticut. You can look that one up online. It's a fancy rich kid school that at the time in the 80s it cost $40,000 a year to attend, which is $10,000 more than my dad made a year. So but when I went there, I discovered really quick, I went from being the smartest kid around to barely being average. Worse, the school required you to wear either this Harry Potter-like school uniform, or you could wear a suit and tie to class. So my dad definitely couldn't afford the Harry Potter uniform, but he could afford to send me with 2 polyester suits and some clip-on ties.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, I fit right in with those rich kids. Except I really super double extra didn't. I also went from being too white to have any friends in my neighborhood to being not white enough to have any friends in my new school. So I once again didn't have a lot of friends, which was something I was familiar with. What I did experience was the freedom of not having to go to church 4 days a week and all day Sunday. And I was freed of all the constant friction and fighting in my house. And it was great. Other than that, I was miserable. My grades suffered, and after 2 years, I never wanted to go back. And my dad was happy to hear it. But coming home after 2 years meant my only option was to go to the local high school in the Bronx in the 80s, where once again, I didn't fit in. I had no friends at school, constant fighting with my dad at home, and after my experience at Hotchkiss, I was afraid to go to college and face that kind of hardship and rejection and failure again. So in 1989, I went to go talk to a Navy recruiter about the only 2 things I liked, airplanes and electronics. And I'll never forget his name. His name was Dwayne Hickett from South Kakalaka. And he asked me a very enticing question. Airplanes and electronics, huh? You want to do both? I didn't need any time to answer that question. And I was pretty smart too, so I passed all those tests. I joined the Navy and went to boot camp in San Diego, California in 1989. Now this was my jam. Nothing they did to me in boot camp was harder than anything I had already come from, and I was easily able to nerd my way through all the academics. I was young, in shape, with money and an exciting job, and I was super lonely. And being lonely helps you make some really smart decisions, right? Except it really super double extra doesn't. So for the first time in my life, I had access to all the porn I wanted, immersed in a culture that at the time encouraged that kind of thing. The craziest part was that I wasn't even sleeping around because I had this warped idea that I was still following Jesus and doing everything else right. So he would just look past my collection of porn magazines and help me find a wife that looked just like one of the women in the magazines, because that's exactly how Jesus works. Right?
Yeah.
No, actually, as it turns out. So by the time I was 23, I was married, I was divorced, and I was a single dad to 2 kids, one of which I wasn't sure was mine. In my head, he was mine, so as far as I was concerned, he was mine, and he's been mine ever since. That's my baby boy.
And he is yours.
And he is, that's right.
It's awesome.
It's like,
He made me lose my spot. And he's awesome, by the way. You gotta meet this kid. So, by this time, I was mad at God and no longer speaking to him because my whole world was falling apart around me, even though I was trying to do everything right. I mean, except the porn, of course. But how big a deal is that with all the drug dealers and drug users I grew up around? I mean, I wasn't doing any of that. The worst part was being a single dad threatened by Navy. Being a single dad made it hard to stay in the Navy, which is the one thing that was actually working out for me. I love my babies. I love my babies. And if it meant leaving the Navy, I would do it if I had to, but I didn't want to. And as it turned out, God had other plans for me, because even though he and I weren't really on speaking terms in that part of my life, he is always faithful. So I met a woman that didn't mind raising my kids with me, and I wasted no time getting married. And for a while, things started coming together. We were even going to church together. We prayed about having another kid. And a year later, another little princess came in my life. So we're going to church. I've got this great Navy job, and everything is awesome, right? Nope. See, I was saved, but I wasn't free. And my wife had hurts and hang-ups of her own that she was struggling with, on top of the hurts, hang-ups, and habits that I was struggling with. Worse, her hang-ups had to do with body image and food addiction, which crashed right up against my hurts, hang-ups, and habits of porn addiction. Bad combo. And it would have been awesome to say I was an understanding and caring and nurturing husband, but I wasn't. I was not. And I'm not proud of this, but I resented her for being overweight, and she resented me for wanting her to lose weight. Meanwhile, so my personal life is circling the drain, while at the same time, my Navy career is totally taking off. And multiple deployments turned into selection for special programs, which turned into a 14-month stint in the Army supporting special projects. Now, let me tell you something. The whole reason I joined the Navy is because I had no interest being in the Army. But there I was, killing it. In 2009, after a boots-on-ground combat deployment, I came home with a bunch of shiny medals most sailors have no business ever earning, a combat injury the Navy let me stay in with, and a whopping case of PTSD.
Yep.
At this point, once again, God and I are barely speaking. Porn was my go-to drug of choice, and my distorted view of intimacy and sexual relationships turned into my first affair. Life at this point got super complicated. My kids were teenagers at this point, and my wife said we're getting a divorce, but not until we go over 20 because she wasn't giving up her share of my retirement. It would be easy to be bitter at something like that, but the one thing she did really well through all of my mess was be an amazing mom to my kids, so I took the deal. At this point in my career, the Navy would let me do anything I wanted. So I took the deal and also took an unaccompanied transfer to Japan for my last 4 years in the Navy. And I remember at one point sitting in my car in 2012 listening to this Andy Grammer pop song called Build Me a Girl, look it up. And just having it out with God, saying, it's not like some big secret how you made me. Why can't you introduce me to the girl I want? Because that's exactly how God works, right? No. But what was weird was this time when I argued with God, it was like he was there. He was there in the car with me all by myself. But he wasn't like this, white robe and bright light and ooh. It wasn't that. Just imagine some old school teacher librarian just looking at me over his glasses like, So, and I could actually see him looking over this list of what I thought my girl should be, right? Going, wow, okay, kiddo, what kind of girl you want? Wow, Nate, this is a pretty detailed list and you make some good points. Then he balled it up and bounced it right off my head. And then he said, let me show you what I have for you. And I could see him wipe this vision in front of my windshield because I'm sitting in my car. And it was incredible. But it wasn't even because of how beautiful she was. What struck me was because he was showing me the woman he had in store for me. So I'm talking to God again. I've got this vision of what he has in store for me. And everything's awesome, right? Nope. See, because it's just not happening fast enough. So God obviously needs my help. Except, as it turns out, the creator of the universe really super double extra doesn't actually need my help. But I thought he did. So I spent my entire time in Japan living what looked like an awesome career. But my personal life was wrapped up in another long-term relationship that I was hoping was going to turn into something. Only to once again, have it burn in ashes all around. I finally retired in 2017 after 27 years in the Navy with nothing to show for it except a bunch of shiny medals that might get you a cup of coffee with $1, but not at Starbucks. A bunch of grown-up kids that I saw maybe a few weeks a year, a marriage that had been burned to cinders, and nothing else. I was actually recruited out of the Navy by a major aerospace company that wanted me to do the same thing I'd been doing, only now as a contractor, which was great, because I could just keep doing what I was doing and I didn't have to grow up. And I still didn't have to make any decisions for myself. I was again deploying all over the world, but burning money as fast as I could make it on absolutely nothing. And I was living in the spare bedroom of another tech guy 20 years younger than me. And a lot of these places I deployed had no internet, so I made sure I could take my porn addiction with me by taking hard drives full of stuff. And after another relationship crashed and burned, I found out I would be going on another deployment to another sandy place, this time in Africa, and I couldn't wait to go. I was tired of life, I was tired of everything else, and the only thing I had to look forward to was my job. How sad is that, when that's where you get? When the only great thing going on in your life is your job. Even crazier, when I finally got to this place, and the work was what I expected, and the job pace was what I expected, and I got tired of looking at porn. Just got tired. I got tired of everything else, and even my job, which I was excited about, just wasn't doing it for me. There's this giant empty space in my life that just got bigger, bigger, bigger. So I started reading this ratty little Gideon New Testament I'd been carrying around in my pocket for decades, since I was in the Navy, like some kind of good luck charm. And the pages were still easy to read because I'd never opened it. But I burned through that entire New Testament in the first 2 months of my deployment. And then I got on my face in my tent and just told God I was tired of running into brick walls with my life. Tired of messing up everything, and tired of being in charge. And I just wanted, you know what, God? How about you be in charge for a while? And without knowing it at the time, I had encountered step 3 of Celebrate Recovery, which is to make a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God, as written in Romans 12:1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I literally told God I didn't want to make decisions for myself anymore, and I wanted him to be in charge of my life. And you know how he replied? Finally, kid! If only you knew what I had in store for you. All those years you were trying to figure it out by yourself. So I'm talking to God again. I finally figured out the difference between being saved and being free. And this time, I'm not chasing religion. I'm pursuing relationship. And I'm not trying to find a woman, just trying to find God. And while trying to find him, I discovered he'd always been right there. And everything's awesome, right? Yes. I learned how to live out step 11. Seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. Praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. As written in Colossians 3:16, let the message of Christ dwell in you richly. I was talking to God all the time now. I was going to church. I was no longer using porn. I was reconnecting with my kids. And I was finally in a place where I wasn't trying to get in a physical relationship with someone. My mom's schizophrenia is full blown now. But God restored the relationship with my dad fully. He restored the relationship with my kids. Then one day in 2019, I walked in the office of a manager I was really close friends with, except it wasn't his office anymore. And I blew right in. And it belonged to a new manager. A lady. And not just any lady, but it was the woman God showed me in 2012. So you know what I did? Nope. I turned right around and hightailed it right out of there because I was like, nope, I'm on this thing with God now. I got this. But I went back and introduced myself just so I wasn't rude. But that night, having shared nothing more with this lady than 2 or 3 sentences, I dug out all the old hard drives I still had filled with porn, and did a root sector erase format of every one of those drives. Erased them. Every one. I wasn't even looking at them, but I wanted them gone. And I never looked back. Come to find out, talking to that lady I met by crashing into her office turned into a first date. And during our first date, she told me, by the way, I'm a pastor. And No kidding. I looked up. Come on, God.
Wheels.
And I literally dropped on my knees. You can ask her. I dropped on my knees. And Jesus said, oh yeah, remember that pastor job I was telling you about when you were 12? Still got it.
Go waiting for you.
So, but first, we joined a group in her church called Celebrate Recovery. And the rest is history. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you for sharing.